They laughed when she said her daughter knew how to perform surgery, until the girl saved the CEO in the middle of a collapse. The weight of the coins in Helen's pocket felt heavier than it should. She counted them for the third time that morning as she walked down Main Street holding Emily's small hand. $2.60. Enough for one sandwich, maybe two if they were lucky. "Mum, my stomach is making noises," Emily whispered, looking at the ground. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know, sweetie. We're going to get something to eat now." Murphy's Diner was on the busiest corner in town. During lunchtime, it was always crowded with business people, college students, and families who could afford to eat out. Helen hesitated at the entrance, watching through the glass. Everyone inside looked like they belonged there. "Let's go," Emily said, pulling on her mother's hand. "I'm really hungry." Helen took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed, announcing their arrival. A few heads turned, glanced briefly, and went back to their conversations. Helen guided Emily to the counter, where a young man in a stained apron was wiping glasses. "Good afternoon," the attendant said. "What can I get for you?" Helen looked at the menu on the wall. The prices danced before her eyes. Burger with fries, $4.50. Chicken sandwich, $3.75. Even the cheapest item cost almost everything she had. "One ham sandwich," she said finally. "Just one." "Would you like fries or a soda with that?" "No, thank you, just the sandwich." Emily looked up at her mother, then at the attendant. She understood. She always understood. Helen pulled the coins from her pocket, one by one. The metallic sound echoed on the scratched Formica counter. 25 cents, 50, 75. The attendant waited patiently as she counted. Other people in line behind them began to shift impatiently. $2.60, Helen said, pushing the coins forward. One of the coins rolled off and fell to the floor. Emily quickly bent down to pick it up, her cheeks red. As she stood up, a man behind them sighed loudly. "You can sit wherever you like," the attendant said kindly. "I'll bring it over when it's ready." Helen found a small table near the window. She and Emily sat on plastic chairs that creaked under their weight. The diner was filled with the buzz of conversations, cutlery clinking against plates, and the sizzle of the hot griddle in the kitchen. Emily swung her legs, which didn't reach the floor. "Mum, when do you think you'll get another job?" The question hit Helen like a punch to the gut. "Soon, I hope. I have a few interviews lined up for next week." It was a lie. She had no interviews scheduled. She had been looking for a job for 3 months, ever since she was laid off from the clinic where she worked as a nursing assistant. The economy was tough, they said. Budget cuts, they said. But Helen knew the truth. At 42, with only a high school diploma, she was no longer competitive in the market. "It's okay," Emily said, as if she could read her mother's thoughts. "We'll manage." Helen smiled, but it was a sad smile. Emily was too mature for her 7 years. She had to be. As they waited for the sandwich, Helen watched the other customers. At the next table, 2 women were talking about their vacation in Europe. Further down, a group of men in suits discussed business, gesturing with forks loaded with food. And in the farthest corner, Helen narrowed her eyes. A man sitting alone was scrolling on his phone, but something about him stood out. His suit was impeccable, expensive. The watch on his wrist gleamed even under the diner's fluorescent lights. His shoes were so polished they reflected the ceiling lights. "Mom, look at that man," Emily murmured. Helen followed her daughter's gaze. The man had stopped looking at his phone. His breathing seemed strange, forced. He brought a hand to his chest and winced. "He must have heartburn," Helen said. "He ate too fast." But Emily kept watching. She had a special way of noticing when people weren't okay. It was something Helen had always admired in her daughter, this ability to perceive details that others missed. The man tried to grab the glass of water on his table, but his hand trembled. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The noise made several people look in his direction. "Sorry," the man said, his voice hoarse. He tried to stand up, but his legs failed him. He staggered to the side and fell heavily to the floor. The impact made the plates on the next table tremble. For a moment, the entire diner fell silent. Then someone screamed, "Oh my God! Someone call an ambulance." People started to get up. Moving closer to the fallen man, Helen felt Emily tug on her sleeve. "Mom, he's not breathing right." Helen looked more closely. The man was on the floor, conscious, but his skin was turning bluish. Each breath seemed like an immense effort, accompanied by a strange wheezing sound. "Has anyone called 911? A woman shouted. "I'm calling now," a man answered, already holding his phone to his ear. Helen stood up and moved closer. She had worked in a clinic for years. She recognized the signs of a respiratory emergency when she saw one. "Excuse me," she said, kneeling beside the man. "Royce, sir, can you hear me?" The man opened his eyes and tried to speak, but only a muffled noise came out. His face was becoming increasingly blue. Helen looked around. "Do you have a first aid kit here?" The attendant rushed behind the counter. "Yes, we do. One moment." He returned with a red box and handed it to Helen. Emily came closer and took the kit from her mother's hands. "I know how to help," Emily said, opening the box. "I need to do a small surgery." The diner erupted in laughter. "A surgery?" A man with a beard laughed loudly. "The little girl wants to perform surgery." "How cute," a woman said, still laughing. "Well, she thinks she's a doctor." "Someone take that kit away from her before she does something stupid," shouted another customer. "Kids these days watch too many movies," an elderly woman commented, shaking her head. "Surgery at 7 years old, that's a good one," another man laughed. Emily looked at all the people laughing at her, then at the man on the floor who was turning more and more purple. She took a deep breath. "Is the ambulance coming soon?" someone asked, still smiling. "They said 15 minutes at least," the man on the phone replied. "Traffic is terrible." 15 minutes. Emily looked at the man on the floor. She knew he didn't have 15 minutes. "I really do know how to help," Emily said, louder this time, cutting through the laughter. "Mrs. Patterson taught us in school." "Mrs. Patterson," a woman laughed. "Her teacher taught her surgery. How absurd." "Stop laughing," Helen said, standing up. "Look at his color." The people stopped laughing and looked. The man was almost blue now. "But she's just a child," said the bearded man, no longer laughing. "This is crazy." Emily knelt beside the man. She had grabbed the first aid kit and was holding it against her chest. "I studied this in school," she said, her voice small but determined. "Mrs. Patterson taught us." The people around began to murmur among themselves. Some seemed outraged and others curious. "This is insane," a woman said. "We're not going to let a child touch him." "She's going to make it worse," another person exclaimed. Emily took a deep breath. Her hands stopped shaking. She looked at all the people around her, then at the man on the floor. "I can try," she said, louder this time. "I just need a chance." The man on the floor managed to open his eyes. His gaze met Emily's. Even with difficulty, he managed to whisper, Do you know what you're doing?" Helen placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. She didn't know where the confidence in her voice came from when she replied, "She does." Emily opened the kit and examined its contents. She remembered Mrs. Patterson's lesson perfectly. The teacher had used a dummy to show where the trachea was, had explained about respiratory obstructions, and had even shown how to make a small emergency incision when there was no other option. "He can't breathe because the air isn't getting through," Emily said, more to herself than to others. "Something is blocking it." She looked at the man's neck, finding the exact spot the teacher had shown. "I'll need to make a small incision in his trachea," she announced. What followed was a chorus of protests. "Are you crazy? Somebody stop that girl. This is attempted murder. Where are her parents?" Helen stood up and positioned herself between Emily and the people trying to get closer. "Look at him," she said, pointing to the man on the floor. "Do you think he has 15 minutes? The people looked. The man had stopped trying to speak. His lips were completely purple now. Emily searched the kit but couldn't find what she needed. "I need a small knife," she said, "or a very sharp blade." "A knife!" someone shouted. Now she's definitely lost her mind. The attendant, who had been watching in shock, ran to the kitchen. He returned with a small, clean and sharp paring knife. "Is this what you need?" he asked, hesitant. Emily took the knife and examined it. "This will work." A few people tried to approach to stop her, but Helen didn't move from her spot. "Let her try," she said firmly. "Look at his color. If you don't do something now, he's going to die right here." Emily knelt beside the man and examined his neck carefully. "He needs an incision in his trachea," she said aloud. The diner exploded in nervous laughter and sarcastic comments. "Seriously? A surgery now?" A man laughed. "What nonsense," a woman chuckled. "A child wanting to play doctor." "This girl has seen too many movies on TV," said another, shaking his head. Emily ignored the laughter and took the small knife the attendant had brought. With the instrument in her hand, she looked directly at all the people around. "I can try," she said with a firm voice, raising the knife. "I just need a chance." The man on the floor, who until then had seemed almost unconscious, opened his eyes when he saw the girl with the knife. His face showed a mix of panic and desperation. "You," he managed to stammer, his voice hoarse and broken. "Do you know what you're doing?" Helen knelt beside her daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked directly into the man's eyes and answered with a certainty that surprised even herself. "She knows." Emily took a deep breath. With one hand, she located the exact spot on his trachea. With the other, she held the knife firmly. "This will hurt a little," she said to the man, her voice now completely calm. With a quick and precise movement, she made a small horizontal cut. Blood appeared, but not as much as she had expected. Immediately, air began to escape through the cut with a loud hiss. The man's chest moved. After a few agonizing seconds, he made a sound, then another. He was breathing. The diner fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the labored but steady breathing of the man on the floor. He opened his eyes slowly. His color began to return to normal. He looked at Emily, who was still kneeling beside him with the knife in her hand, and then at Helen. "How?" He tried to speak. "Don't strain yourself," Emily said, wiping the knife on a napkin. "You need to stay still until the ambulance arrives." One of the customers, a man in a suit who had been shouting against the procedure, approached slowly. "My God," he murmured. "She really saved him." "How does a 7-year-old girl know how to do something like that?" asked the woman who had been protesting earlier. Emily shrugged. "Mrs. Patterson taught us in school. She said, if someone couldn't breathe at all and there was no doctor around, you could try to do this." "But it's a complex medical procedure," said another man. "Doctors study for years to learn this." "Anyone can learn," Emily replied simply. "Mrs. Patterson said saving lives isn't just for doctors." The man on the floor managed to lift one of his hands. He gestured for Emily to come closer. When she leaned in, he managed to whisper, What's your name?" "Emily." "Emily," he repeated. "Thank you. You saved me." Emily smiled. "It's what I learned in school." Helen knelt beside her daughter and hugged her. Her own hands were shaking now from relief and pride. "You were incredible," she whispered in Emily's ear. "I was really scared," Emily confessed quietly. "I know, but you did it anyway. That's real courage." The sound of sirens began to approach from outside. Emily looked out the window and saw the red and blue lights getting closer. "The ambulance," she said. The man on the floor tried to sit up, but Emily gestured for him to stay down. "It's better not to move too much," she said. "They'll take proper care of you now." The sirens grew louder until they stopped right in front of the diner. 2 paramedics rushed in, carrying medical equipment. They stopped abruptly when they saw the man on the floor, conscious and breathing through an incision in his neck. "Who did this?" one of the paramedics asked, kneeling to examine the procedure. Everyone in the diner pointed to Emily. The paramedic looked at her, then at Helen, then back at Emily. His expression was one of pure disbelief. "You did this?" he asked. "He couldn't breathe," Emily explained calmly. "So I did what I learned in school." The paramedic examined the incision carefully. After a few seconds, he looked at his colleague. "It's perfect," he said, impressed. "She saved his life. If it weren't for this incision, he wouldn't have made it until we got here." They began to prepare the man for transport. As they worked, the first paramedic kept looking at Emily. "How old are you?" "7. He shook his head. "In 15 years on this job, I've never seen anything like it. You have a gift, kid." Helen felt a tightness in her chest. Pride mixed with a deep worry. Emily clearly had a special talent, but how was an unemployed mother going to give her daughter the opportunities she deserved? The paramedics finished stabilizing the man and placed him on a stretcher. Before being taken to the ambulance, he searched for Emily with his eyes. "Emily," he called. She approached the stretcher. "Thank you so much," he said. "You gave me a second chance at life." "Get well soon," Emily replied, "and try not to choke anymore." The innocent comment drew a smile from the man, even in his condition. "How can I find you?" he asked. "To thank you properly." Helen quickly stepped forward. "There's no need, sir. We did what anyone would do." "No," he said firmly. "Not just anyone. She saved my life. I need to repay this somehow." "Just get better soon," Helen said. "That's enough." The paramedics began to push the stretcher outside. The man kept looking at Emily until he disappeared through the door. When the ambulance left, the activity in the diner slowly returned to normal. But people still looked at Emily with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The attendant approached with the sandwich Helen had ordered an eternity ago. "It's on the house," he said, placing the plate on the table. "In fact, you can order whatever you want. I won't charge you a thing." Helen was about to refuse, but Emily really needed to eat. Thank you," she said simply. They sat back down at the table. Emily bit into the sandwich hungrily, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Emily," Helen said, "do you have any idea what you just did?" Emily thought for a moment. "I saved that man." "Yes, you saved his life. At 7 years old." Emily shrugged. "Mrs. Patterson always said everyone can help, no matter their age." Helen smiled, but she also felt tears in her eyes. Her daughter was special, more special than she had ever imagined. "Do you want to be a doctor when you grow up?" she asked. Emily chewed thoughtfully. "Maybe, if I can study enough." The simple answer brought back the full reality of their situation. How was Emily going to study medicine if they barely had enough money for a sandwich? Helen collected the first aid kit, which was still open on the table, and returned it to the attendant. "Thanks for lending us this," she said. "Of course," he replied. "Your daughter is an angel. She literally saved a man's life in here today." Helen took Emily's hand. "Come on, sweetie. It's time to go home." They walked to the door. The bell chimed as Helen pushed it open, saying goodbye to a day neither of them would ever forget. Outside on the sidewalk, Emily looked back. "Mom, do you think we'll see that man again?" Helen looked at her daughter. "I don't know, sweetie. Why?" "He seemed important. And sad too." Helen didn't know that the man Emily had saved was Victor Langdon, one of the wealthiest men in the region. She didn't know that he would never forget what happened in that diner, and she didn't know that their lives were about to change forever. For now, they just walked home. Emily swinging her mother's hand, wondering if she could ever really be a doctor, and Helen wondering how she was going to give her daughter the future she deserved. The darkness of the hospital room enveloped Victor as he opened his eyes. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The white ceiling above him was covered in shadows, and the only sound was the steady beep of a nearby monitor. 3:47 a.m. The digital clock on the bedside table showed. Victor tried to swallow and felt the discomfort in his neck. The bandage was there, reminding him of everything that had happened. Slowly, he brought a hand to the spot where the girl had made the cut. The girl. He closed his eyes and tried to reconstruct every detail of those moments in the diner, the feeling of suffocation, the rising panic when he realized he couldn't breathe. And then, amidst the chaos and shouting voices, a small, calm voice. "I can try. I just need a chance." Victor moved his head on the pillow, searching for a more comfortable position. The movement caused the bandage to pull slightly, reminding him again of the precision with which those small hands had worked. How was it possible? A 7-year-old child performing a procedure that many adults didn't even know existed. The nurse had come by earlier and explained that he was stable. The surgeon would come in the morning to assess whether the cut could be closed or if they needed to do anything else. But everyone agreed on one thing. If it hadn't been for the little doctor, as the nurse had called Emily, he would not have survived. Victor ran a hand over his face. He was tired, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that scene again. The girl kneeling beside him, completely focused, ignoring all the screaming adults around her. And her mother, Helen. He remembered the way she had defended her daughter, standing between Emily and the people trying to stop her. He remembered the confidence in her voice when she said, "She knows." But what bothered him most was how they had disappeared. When the ambulance arrived, when the paramedics confirmed that the procedure had saved his life, he had looked for them. He wanted to thank them, to know their names, to understand how it was all possible, but they were gone. Victor looked out the hospital window. The city was quiet below, with only a few lights scattered among the buildings. Somewhere in that darkness, Emily and Helen were sleeping, probably at home, with no idea how they had changed his life. He had built an empire. He was a CEO. He had companies in 3 countries, employed thousands of people, and made decisions that moved millions of dollars every day. But none of that had mattered when he was on the floor of that diner, struggling to breathe. What had mattered was the courage of a 7-year-old girl. Victor tried to remember the last time someone had done something for him without wanting anything in return. He couldn't. In his life, everything had a price. Every kindness came with a hidden agenda. Every favor expected a favor back. But Emily didn't know who he was. To her, he was just a man who needed help. The bandage itched a little, and Victor resisted the urge to touch it. The doctors had been clear. He couldn't touch the area until the next evaluation. He thought about the precision of the cut. The paramedics had been impressed. The emergency room doctor had called other colleagues to see. They all agreed it had been made in exactly the right place, at the right depth. Where did she learn that? Dr. Morrison, the chief surgeon, had asked. In school, Victor had replied, still drowsy from the medication. Her teacher taught her. Dr. Morrison had shaken his head in disbelief. In 40 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like it. A child performing an emergency tracheostomy. And doing it right. Victor turned on his side in bed, trying to find a position that didn't bother his neck. The room was too warm, but he didn't want to call the nurse. He needed to be alone with his thoughts. He thought about Emily's and Helen's clothes. Simple, a bit worn, the mother counting coins to buy a sandwich. They clearly didn't have much money. And yet, when he needed help, they hadn't hesitated. Victor had met many people throughout his life. Businessmen, politicians, celebrities. They all wanted something from him. His influence, his money, his contacts. But that girl and her mother had given him something precious without asking for anything in return. They had given him his life back. The monitor's beep continued its steady rhythm. Victor looked at the machine, seeing the numbers that confirmed his heart was beating, that his lungs were working, all thanks to Emily. He had to find them. He didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't name yet. There was something about that girl that fascinated him. It wasn't just the medical skill, though that was impressive. It was her calmness, her determination, the way she had ignored all the screaming adults and focused on what needed to be done. And there was something about Helen, too, the courage to let her daughter try. The trust in Emily's ability, even when everyone around was saying it was madness. Victor ran a hand through his hair. He was starting to sweat a little. The hospital air conditioning always left the rooms at a strange temperature. He thought about his company, about the appointments he had missed today. His secretary was probably reorganizing his entire schedule. Meetings being cancelled, contracts waiting for his signature, but none of that seemed important now. What mattered was that he was alive, and he owed it to a girl who didn't even know his name. Victor looked at the ceiling again. The shadows had shifted slightly as the night wore on. In a few hours, The sun would rise, and the hospital would come back to life. Doctors would make their rounds, nurses would change dressings, visitors would fill the hallways, but for now, it was just him and the silence, and the questions that wouldn't leave his mind. Where did they live? How had Emily really learned that? Why had they left without saying anything? Victor closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the images returned. Emily kneeling beside him, completely focused. Helen defending her daughter against all the critics, the two of them leaving the diner as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He had to find them. He couldn't rest until he thanked them properly, until he understood who these people were who had appeared in his life when he needed them most. The bandage pulled again as he moved, reminding him of the debt he now carried, a debt he didn't know how to repay. Victor opened his eyes and looked into the darkness of the room. "Who are you?" he whispered into the silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but Victor knew he wouldn't rest until he found out. Victor adjusted his tie for the third time as he walked along the sidewalk toward Murphy's diner. 3 days had passed since he was discharged from the hospital, 3 days in which he couldn't think of anything else but the two people who had changed his life forever. The morning was clear, with a gentle sun warming the still quiet streets. It was different from that hectic Thursday when he almost died in this very place. Now, midweek, the diner had a calmer rhythm. Victor stopped in front of the glass door and took a deep breath. The bell above the entrance chimed as he pushed the door open, a sound that now had a special meaning for him. It was the same sound Emily and Helen had heard when they came in to count coins and buy a sandwich. The inside of the diner seemed smaller than he remembered. A few tables were occupied by solitary customers reading newspapers or typing on laptops. The smell of coffee and grilled bacon filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of those terrible moments when he was struggling to breathe. Victor looked around, identifying each significant spot. There, in the corner, was the table where he had been sitting when it all began. He remembered scrolling through his phone, reviewing contracts, when he felt the first tightness in his chest. And there, by the window, was where Emily and Helen had sat, carefully counting their coins. The same attendant from Thursday was behind the counter, organizing glasses on shelves. Victor approached slowly, trying to control the anxiety he felt. His hands were sweating a little. "Excuse me," he said, resting one hand on the scratched Formica counter. The young man turned, and his eyes widened immediately. He was young, probably a college student, with messy brown hair and an easy smile. "I don't believe it," he exclaimed, nearly dropping the glass he was holding. "You're the man who that little girl saved." "That's me," Victor confirmed, trying to smile. "How are you?" "I'm fine, but what about you? My God, is everything okay? You look great." The boy seemed genuinely thrilled. "Man, that day was the craziest of my life. I've never seen anything like it." "I'm doing very well, thank you," Victor replied. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I wanted to ask you something important." Of course, anything." The attendant leaned forward, clearly curious. Victor hesitated for a moment, choosing his words. "The girl who saved me, and her mother, do you know who they are?" The young man frowned, thoughtful. "You mean their full names, address?" "Any information. I need to find them to thank them properly." The attendant scratched his head, clearly trying to remember a useful detail. "Look, I know the girl's name was Emily, and the mom, Helen, I think. But besides that," he shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, but they never came back here. Never again." Victor felt a pang of disappointment. "Not once. And I work here Monday through Saturday, from 7 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. If they had come back, I would have seen them." The young man paused, thoughtful. "You know, they didn't seem like regular customers. In fact, they seemed kind of, how can I put it, nervous. Like they weren't used to eating out." Victor vividly remembered the scene. Helen counting coins one by one, Emily waiting patiently, the hesitation before ordering just one sandwich. The signs were all there, but he had been too busy with his own problems to notice. Did they say anything that might give a clue? About where they lived and where the girl went to school. The attendant bit his lip, concentrating. Let me think. They sat at that little table by the window. They talked quietly. The girl, Emily, she was very quiet. She only really spoke when she saved you. And they didn't mention anything about school, a neighborhood, nothing. Not that I heard. But to be honest, I was pretty busy that day. It was rush hour, you know. The young man paused. After the ambulance took you, a few people were asking about them too. Everyone wanted to know who they were, but nobody knew anything. Victor sighed, feeling his frustration grow. Other people asked, "Yeah." Some customers who were here that day came back later, wanting to know if they had shown up again. Everyone was impressed by what happened, but it's like they just disappeared. Victor leaned both hands on the counter, trying to process the information. How was it possible that two people who had made such an impact could simply vanish without a trace? You don't have any idea where they might be? The attendant shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, man. I wish I could help more. That girl, she was incredible. I'll never forget her courage. Thanks anyway, Victor said, trying to hide the disappointment in his voice. If they show up here again, you got it. I'll ask them to wait and call you right away. What's your number? Victor gave his card to the young man, who carefully tucked it into his pocket. I hope you find them, the attendant said. They deserve to know you're okay. Victor nodded and headed for the door. Outside, he stopped on the sidewalk and looked around. The city suddenly seemed immense. Emily and Helen were out there somewhere. But where? He spent the next few hours visiting establishments in the area. He went into pharmacies, asking if they knew a girl named Emily who knew a lot about first aid. He visited small markets, showing the descriptions he had written on a piece of paper. He stopped at other cheap diners and restaurants, asking if they had ever seen a mother and daughter who matched the description. In every place, the answer was the same. Maybe, not sure. I don't remember. Some faces seemed familiar, but no one had concrete information. At the Oak Street clinic, an elderly pharmacist said she might have seen a woman with a little girl buying cheap bandages, but she wasn't sure if they were the same people. At Wilson's supermarket, an employee thought he might remember a child who always asked about medicines when her mother wasn't looking, but again, nothing definite. As the sun began to set, Victor was driving back home, tired and frustrated. He had spent the entire day searching, visited dozens of places, spoken to countless people, and had nothing concrete to show for his efforts. At the traffic light on Main Street, he stopped and rested his forehead on the steering wheel for a moment. How could he find two people in a city of 500,000 when all he knew were their first names? The late afternoon traffic was heavy, typical for a Thursday. Victor looked around, watching the movement of people on the sidewalks, hurried executives returning from work, college students carrying heavy backpacks, mothers pushing strollers, elderly people walking slowly with their shopping bags, and street vendors. Victor had never paid much attention to them before. He was always too busy, always in too much of a hurry to notice. But now, as he waited for the light to turn green, he watched more carefully. There was a man on the corner selling newspapers, shouting the day's headlines. A woman with a colorful cart offered cotton candy to the children passing by. Two teenagers sold flowers to couples walking hand in hand. And then he saw it. About 100 yards ahead, a small figure was walking between the stopped cars, offering something to the drivers. Even from a distance, even with all the movement around, something about that silhouette made Victor's heart race. It was a small girl wearing simple clothes. She carried a small basket and moved carefully between the vehicles, stopping at drivers' windows to offer what looked like candy. Victor narrowed his eyes, trying to see better. The girl had her back to him, but there was something familiar in the way she moved, her height, her size. When she turned to approach another car, Victor saw her face in profile. Emily. His heart almost stopped. It was her, without a shadow of a doubt. The same hair, the same serious and focused face, the same determined posture he remembered from the diner. Victor looked around desperately, searching for Helen. He found her a few yards ahead, leaning against a lamppost, watching Emily from a distance. She wore a faded blouse and jeans and looked tired, but she was clearly keeping an eye on her daughter. The light turned green, but Victor couldn't move. The cars behind him started honking impatiently, but he didn't care. He quickly turned on his signal and maneuvered the car to the shoulder, pulling over near the curb. His hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine. After searching all day, he had found them both by pure chance. Emily was approaching the area where he had parked. When she got near the car, Victor slowly lowered the window, trying not to startle her. "Emily," he called softly. The girl stopped and looked at him, frowning. For a moment she seemed confused and as if trying to remember where she had seen that face before. Then her eyes widened in recognition. "You," she exclaimed, taking a few steps toward the car. "The man from the diner." "That's me," Victor smiled, feeling a wave of relief and happiness. "How are you, Emily?" "I'm good." She moved closer to the window, clearly happy to see him. "And you, is your neck all better?" "It's all better." "Thanks to you." Helen, who had noticed Emily stop by a car talking to someone, began to approach quickly. When she recognized Victor, she stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk, looking like she didn't know whether to run or approach. Victor saw her hesitation and got out of the car slowly, keeping his hands visible and moving in a non-threatening way. "Helen," he said, his voice soft and respectful. "I've been looking for you." Helen approached cautiously, pulling Emily closer to her. Her eyes showed a mixture of surprise, nervousness, and confusion. "Looking? Why?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I needed to thank you," Victor explained, taking a small step forward. "Properly. You saved my life and disappeared before I could really talk to you." Helen relaxed slightly, but still seemed tense. "You didn't need to look for us for that. We did what any decent person would do." "No," Victor shook his head emphatically. "Not just any person. Your daughter did something extraordinary. And you had the courage to let her try when all the other adults were screaming it was madness." Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can I talk to him for a little bit?" Helen looked at Victor for a long moment, studying his face, trying to read his intentions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. Just for a few minutes," she said, still cautious. Victor felt a wave of relief. "Thank you so much. Helen, Emily, please accept an invitation to get something to eat with me. I would really like to talk with you, to thank you properly." Helen visibly hesitated. Victor could see the internal conflict reflected in her eyes. There was distrust, but also exhaustion and perhaps like a bit of need. "We don't want to be a bother," she said finally. "You wouldn't be a bother at all. On the contrary, it would be an honor for me." Helen looked at Emily, who was clearly curious and interested in talking more with the man they had helped. After a long pause, she assented with a discreet nod. "All right. But it has to be somewhere simple." "Of course. Do you know Tony's Diner? It's right near here, 2 blocks away." Helen nodded that she knew the place. Victor offered to drive them, but Helen preferred to walk. They agreed to meet at the restaurant in 15 minutes. Tony's Diner was exactly the kind of place Victor had in mind. Simple, welcoming, unpretentious. It had formica tables with red vinyl booths, pendant lamps over each table, and the comforting smell of home-cooked food. Victor arrived first and chose a booth in the back, away from the window, where they could talk in private. When Helen and Emily entered, he waved for them to join him. "Please, sit wherever you feel most comfortable," he said, indicating the booth. Helen and Emily sat across from him, still a bit wary but clearly interested. "Please, order whatever you'd like," Victor said, handing them the menus. "Don't worry about the price." Emily opened the menu with bright eyes, clearly impressed with the options. "Mom, look! They have chocolate and strawberry milkshakes." Helen smiled gently, the first time Victor had seen her do so. "You can pick whatever you want, sweetie." They placed their orders. Emily chose a hamburger with fries and a chocolate milkshake. Helen ordered soup and coffee, and Victor ordered just a coffee, claiming he wasn't very hungry. For a few moments, they sat in silence, each processing the strangeness of the situation. "How's your neck?" Emily asked, breaking the silence with her natural curiosity. Victor lightly touched the spot where the cut had been made. "It's healing very well. The doctor said it will only leave a small scar, and it doesn't hurt at all." "Good," Emily smiled, relieved. "I was worried I had hurt you." "You saved me, Emily. Any discomfort was worth it." Helen was looking at her own hands, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "We really didn't expect to see you again," she said quietly. "Why not?" Helen shrugged, still avoiding eye contact. "People like you, important people, don't usually remember people like us after the problem is solved." Victor frowned. "How do you know I'm important?" "It's not hard to tell," Helen answered simply. "Your watch, your clothes, your car, the way you speak. We learn to recognize these things." Victor looked at his own wrist, at the expensive watch he wore without a second thought, at the clothes that to him were just normal, but to Helen and Emily represented a completely different world. "That doesn't change anything," Amy said firmly. "You saved me, that's what matters." The waiter brought their drinks and food. Emily attacked the hamburger with enthusiasm, clearly very hungry. Helen sipped her soup slowly, still tense. Victor watched them for a few moments, noticing details he had missed at the other diner. Emily's clothes were clean, but worn. Helen's shoes were worn down at the soles. Both seemed too thin. "Can I ask a question?" Victor said carefully. Are you going through hard times?" Helen tensed immediately. "Why do you want to know?" "I saw you selling candy on the street, and at the diner you were counting coins very carefully." Helen looked down, and Victor realized he had touched a raw nerve. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just concerned." Helen was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with some internal decision. Emily had stopped eating and was looking at her mother with concern. Finally, Helen sighed deeply and began to speak, still looking at the table. "I had a good job," she said, her voice low and filled with sadness. "One that paid well. My daughter went to a private school, had everything a child needs. But when the company decided to cut costs, when they didn't need me anymore, they let me go." Victor waited patiently, not wanting to interrupt her. "After that, everything was lost," Helen continued, her voice growing weaker with each word. "The savings ran out faster than I imagined. I had to pull Emily out of private school. We had to move to a much smaller, cheaper place." She paused, took a deep breath, and continued with difficulty. "Now we're in a small apartment, in a neighborhood that's not very good. We're several months behind on rent. The landlord is losing his patience. If I can't pay soon, he's going to evict us." The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Emily had completely abandoned her hamburger and was looking sadly at her mother. Victor felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Helen," he began, but she cut him off. "I'm not telling you this to get pity," she said quickly, raising her eyes to meet his. "And we don't want charity. I'm just explaining why you saw us selling candy on the street. We're doing what we can to survive." Victor took a deep breath, trying to process everything he had just heard. These two people, who had saved his life without asking for anything in return, were struggling just to have a roof over their heads. He looked at Emily, who had gone back to sadly stirring her milkshake. "Emily," he said, gently changing the subject, "can I ask where you learned to do that, what you did to me at the diner?" Emily looked at him with her big, serious eyes. "In school," she answered in a small, slightly embarrassed voice. "There was a special first aid class. The teacher taught us where to cut if someone couldn't breathe. I did what she showed us." Victor shook his head, still impressed. "But Emily, that's not a simple thing. It's a very complex and dangerous medical procedure." Emily shrugged with the typical innocence of a child. "Mrs. Patterson said everyone can learn to save lives, that you don't have to be a doctor to help someone who is dying. She said that sometimes an ordinary person can be the difference between someone's life and death." "Was Mrs. Patterson your teacher?" "She was," Emily confirmed, her voice becoming more animated as she talked about her school. She was the best teacher in the world. She taught lots of useful things, not just normal subjects. She brought in special dummies and showed the whole class where the trachea is, how to make the small cut if the person is choking, and there's no other way to help. Victor looked at Helen. What school did she attend? Riverside Elementary School, Helen replied, her voice filled with nostalgia and sadness. It was an excellent school. Emily learned so much there, had extra classes, participated in special activities. Helen nodded, trying to hide the pain in her voice. I had to take her out of there when I lost my job. I couldn't afford the tuition anymore. Now she's not in school. The last sentence was almost a whisper, laden with shame and sorrow. Victor felt his chest tighten painfully. Emily had learned to save lives in a school she was forced to leave due to financial problems, and now, at 7 years old, she was out of school, selling candy on the street to help her mother pay the rent. The silence that followed was filled with respect, emotion, and a growing determination on Victor's part. He looked at Emily, who had gone back to drinking her milkshake as if the conversation were perfectly normal, and then at Helen, who was struggling to hide her shame and desperation. Victor smiled, but it was an emotional smile, filled with admiration, gratitude, and a determination that was growing with every second. The silence was filled with respect. Victor smiled, moved. Victor woke up before his alarm went off. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:43 a.m., but he had been wide awake for at least an hour. He had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation at Tony's diner, Helen's words echoing persistently in his mind. Several months behind on rent. If I can't pay soon, they're going to evict us. The image of Emily selling candy on the street to help her mother wouldn't leave his thoughts. A 7-year-old girl who should be in school, learning and playing, was on the streets trying to earn a few dollars to prevent her and her mother from becoming homeless. At 8 in the morning sharp, Victor was already driving through the city streets toward the address Helen had discreetly mentioned the night before. She hadn't given the address directly, but during their conversation, she had let it slip that they lived near Mr. John's Bakery on Flower Street, in those old red brick buildings. Victor had easily found the bakery using his GPS and was now looking for the buildings Helen had described. The neighborhood was very different from the area where Victor lived. The streets were narrower, with small houses and old 2- or 3-story buildings. Some houses had tiny front gardens. Others had only a narrow sidewalk separating the door from the street. The streets were beginning to get busy with people going to work, children running to school with backpacks, and small shopkeepers opening their stores and arranging their goods in the windows. Victor parked in front of a 3-story red brick building that looked like it had been built several decades ago. The paint on the facade was peeling in some places, revealing the brick underneath, but the building seemed structurally sound and well kept. There were small balconies on each floor, some decorated with potted plants, others serving as a place to dry clothes. He checked the address he had mentally noted the night before and took a deep breath before approaching the building's entrance. There was a row of buzzers next to the main door, each with a small piece of paper identifying the apartment. Victor found apt to be and pressed the button. A few seconds later, he heard the sound of footsteps coming down a wooden staircase. The door opened slowly and Helen appeared, wearing a simple light blue robe, her hair still messy from sleep. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there at the entrance. "Victor," she said, clearly surprised and a bit confused. "What are you doing here? How did you—" "Good morning, Helen." "Good. Sorry to show up so early, sir, but I needed to talk to you about something important." Helen looked nervously from side to side, as if worried about the neighbors seeing a clearly well-dressed and prosperous man at her building's door. "Did something happen? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, yes. But may I come up? What I need to talk to you about is really important." Helen hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between letting him in and maintaining her privacy. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "Of course. Sorry about the mess upstairs. I wasn't expecting visitors." They went up a narrow wooden staircase that creaked under their weight with every step. The handrail was a bit loose in some spots, and Victor noticed that the paint on the hallway walls was faded and needed a new coat. The second-floor hallway had a worn, floral-patterned carpet and several wooden doors with hand-painted numbers. Helen stopped in front of the door marked 2B in peeling black numbers and opened it with a key she took from her robe pocket. The apartment was small but tidy. Victor could see everything at once: a living room with an old but clean sofa, a small television on a wooden table, a kitchenette separated by a low counter, and two doors that likely led to the bedroom and bathroom. But what caught his attention the most were the cardboard boxes stacked against the living room walls. "Sorry about all this mess," Helen said nervously, removing some folded clothes from a chair so Victor could sit. "We're organizing some things." Victor looked around more carefully, observing the boxes. They didn't look like they were being unpacked after a recent move. On the contrary, they looked like they were being prepared for a future move. Some were open and half full, others were already closed and stacked, as if ready to be loaded. "Mom!" a familiar voice called from the kitchen. Emily appeared from behind the counter, wearing pink pajamas with a unicorn print and holding a bowl of cereal with milk. When she saw Victor, her face lit up completely. "Victor," she exclaimed, dropping the bowl on the counter and running to hug him. "You came to visit? What a nice surprise." "I did," he smiled, bending down to return the girl's warm hug. "How are you, Emily? Did you sleep well?" "I did. And I dreamed you were teaching us how to drive a car," Emily laughed. "For are you having breakfast with us?" Helen approached quickly, clearly trying to control the situation. "Emily, finish your cereal first. Victor is probably busy and needs to get to work." "Actually," Victor said calmly, looking directly at Helen, "I came here for a very specific reason." Helen tensed immediately, her hands clenching nervously. "What reason?" Victor glanced once more at the stacked boxes, then back at Helen. His expression was serious but gentle. "Are you moving?" Helen looked down and was silent for a few seconds before answering. We have to leave." "When?" "The landlord gave us an ultimatum. By Friday of this week. If I don't pay everything I owe by then, he's going to evict us." Victor felt a tightness in his chest. "How much time do you have to find another place?" "We don't have time," Helen said quietly. "And even if we did, I don't have money for a deposit on another place. If we leave here, I don't know where we'll go." "How much do you owe in rent?" Helen shook her head firmly. "Victor, please, you were already too kind to us last night. I don't want you to worry about our problems. It's not your responsibility." "Helen," Victor said more firmly, "how much do you owe?" She was silent for a long moment, clearly reluctant to reveal the information. Emily had stopped eating and was watching the conversation attentively, sensing the tension in the air. 3 months of back rent, Helen finally whispered, as if admitting it was painful. $1,200 in total. Victor nodded as if it were a perfectly reasonable amount, though he knew very well that for Helen, that sum represented an impossible mountain to climb, especially without a job. "I'm going to pay the rent and make sure you have security," he said, with all the calmness in the world. The silence that followed was total and heavy. Helen stared at him as if he had just spoken in a completely foreign language. "What did you say?" "I said I'm going to pay your rent debt, and I'm going to make sure you don't have to worry about it for a good long while." Helen shot up from her chair so abruptly she almost knocked it over. "No, absolutely not. You can't do something like that." "Yes, I can, and I'm going to." "We don't want charity," Helen said, her voice rising slightly, showing desperation mixed with wounded pride. "I already made it very clear last night. We don't want you to feel obligated to help us because of what happened." Emily dropped her spoon in the bowl with a clatter and ran to take her mother's hand with her 2 small ones. "Mom," she said softly, looking at Helen with her big, serious eyes, "he wants to help us." "Why is that bad?" "Emily, you don't understand how these things work," Helen said, trying to control the emotion in her voice. We can't just accept this kind of help from someone. Why not? Emily asked, with the simple, direct logic that only a child possesses. Helen looked at her daughter, then at Victor, clearly fighting an intense internal battle. Because when you accept financial help from someone, you owe that person. And we have no way of paying it back. We don't want to be in debt to anyone. Victor stood up from his chair and approached the two of them, moving slowly so as not to seem intimidating. Helen, you and Emily saved my life. You literally gave me a second chance to keep living. How can you think I feel obligated to help? I feel grateful, deeply grateful. But that's a lot of money. To me, it's not, Victor said with complete honesty. And for you, this amount means the difference between having a roof over your heads or living on the street. Emily, do you want your mom to accept my help? Emily nodded vigorously, still holding tightly to Helen's hand. Mom, please, she said, her voice small but full of pleading. I don't want us to have to live on the street. I'm scared of living on the street. Helen looked at her daughter's pleading face, at the big eyes filled with worry, and Victor saw the exact moment her resistance and pride shattered. All right, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. But I want it to be very clear that this is a loan. I will find a way to pay it back, even if it takes many years. Victor smiled gently. If it makes you feel better and more comfortable, you can consider it an interest-free loan with no fixed term. An hour and a half later, Victor was sitting in the small, cramped office of the building's landlord. A middle-aged man with a graying mustache named Mr. Rodriguez. The man seemed genuinely surprised to see someone so well-dressed and prosperous wanting to pay Helen's debt. Are you a relative of hers? A brother, maybe? He asked curiously, as he carefully counted the money Victor had handed over. I'm a friend of the family. Helen is a good tenant, always has been, Mr. Rodriguez said, putting the money in a small safe behind his desk. Always on time with the rent until she lost her job a few months ago. I feel sorry for her and the girl. I really do. But business is business, you understand? I can't keep an apartment occupied without getting paid. I understand your position perfectly, Victor said diplomatically. Here is the full payment for the 3 months in arrears, plus the next 6 months paid in advance. Mr. Rodriguez stopped organizing his papers and looked directly at Victor, clearly surprised. 6 months in advance? That's very unusual. I want to ensure Helen has stability and peace of mind for a while. And if she has any trouble in the future, please call me first before taking any action. Victor handed him his personal card. Mr. Rodriguez took the card and read it carefully. Of course. I'll be sure to call. When Victor returned to the apartment, he found Helen sitting at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. Emily was beside her, gently stroking her mother's hair. Helen, Victor called softly from the door. She lifted her face slowly, and Victor saw that tears were silently streaming down her cheeks. Is everything all right? Did something happen? Helen stood up from the chair and walked directly to him, wrapping him in a tight hug as she cried with pure relief. Thank you, she sobbed against his chest. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to us. I was so desperate. I didn't know what to do anymore. Victor returned the hug, feeling a strong tightness in his chest as he realized the desperation Helen had been hiding. You don't have to thank me, Helen. You deserve security and peace. Emily joined the hug, wrapping her small arms around both of them. Now we won't have to live on the street, she said, clearly relieved. Now we can stay in our house. Exactly, Victor confirmed, moved. You are safe here for as long as you want. After that day, Victor began to visit Helen and Emily regularly. At first, Helen was still visibly tense whenever he appeared at the door, as if expecting him to demand something in return for all the help he had given. But slowly, as the days passed and Victor continued to show up just to talk and spend time with them, Helen gradually relaxed. Victor started bringing small but important things. Fresh and varied food from the expensive market downtown, new clothes for Emily, who was growing quickly and whose clothes were getting small, colorful books full of interesting and educational stories, that he thought Emily would like. "You really don't have to keep bringing all these things," Helen would say every time, though Victor noticed she didn't seem truly bothered. "I know I don't have to," Victor would always reply with a smile, "but I want to. It makes me happy to be able to do this." Emily grew attached to Victor with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including himself. She would run to the door whenever she heard his familiar footsteps on the wooden stairs, proudly show him all the drawings she made during the day, and ask him to read stories to her before bed when he stayed late. One evening, about 3 weeks after the first rent payment, Victor was sitting on the living room floor with Emily. They were painting together at a low wooden table he had brought especially for Emily's artistic activities, using a complete set of watercolor paints and brushes of different sizes that Emily had shyly requested a week before. "What are you painting today?" Victor asked, watching the colorful drawing Emily was creating with intense concentration. "It's our family," Emily said, without looking up from the paper, completely focused on her work. Victor looked closer at the drawing. There were 3 clearly defined figures on the paper: a tall woman with long brown hair, a small girl in a colorful dress, and a tall man wearing a suit. "Can I ask who's who?" "Of course," Emily smiled, pointing to each figure. "This one is Mommy, this little one is me, and this big one is you." Victor felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm in your family drawing." "Of course you are," Emily said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're part of our family now, aren't you?" Victor looked at Helen Mas, who was in the kitchen preparing tea for them. She had heard the whole conversation and was smiling softly, watching the interaction between them. "Emily," Victor said carefully, choosing his words, "can I ask you something important?" "You can ask me anything." Victor hesitated for a moment, then asked in a soft voice, "Will you be our friend forever?" Emily stopped painting completely and looked up to face him directly. Her big, serious eyes studied his face for a few seconds before she answered, "Are you going to be our friend forever?" Victor smiled, feeling a deep, indefinable emotion growing in his chest. "I hope so," he said, his voice becoming a little hoarse with emotion. "Then I'll be your friend forever too." Emily smiled radiantly and went back to painting as if she had just resolved the most important issue in the world. Helen watched the whole scene from afar, leaning against the kitchen doorway. Victor could see something fundamental changing in her expression. The constant suspicion she had carried since they met was slowly being replaced by something much softer and warmer. For the first time in a long time, Helen seemed to be truly relaxing and letting her guard down. Maybe it was really possible to trust again. Maybe not all people wanted something in return for their kindness. Maybe Victor really did care about them without ulterior motives or hidden agendas, and without any of them knowing it yet. In a few days, they would discover that the connection between them was much deeper and more significant than anyone could have ever imagined. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. The sun streamed through the living room window, creating golden stripes on the apartment floor. Victor was sitting on the sofa reading a book to Emily, who was snuggled up beside him, with her head resting on his arm. Helen was in the kitchen, but the movement had stopped a few minutes ago. Victor looked in her direction and saw her standing in front of a small bookshelf, holding something in her hands. She seemed to be struggling with some important internal decision. "Helen?" he called softly. "Is everything okay?" Helen sighed deeply and turned to them. In her hands, she held an old photograph with edges yellowed by time. "I never told you everything," she said, her voice filled with an emotion Victor couldn't quite identify. Emily lifted her head from the book, curious. Victor closed the book and gave Helen his full attention. "What do you mean?" Helen walked slowly towards them, the photograph trembling slightly in her hands. "About my previous job. About how I really lost my job." She hesitated for a moment. "About who I was caring for before everything went wrong." Victor felt something tighten in his chest. Helen seemed to be on the verge of revealing something very important and painful. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he said gently. "I have to," Helen replied, sitting in the armchair across from the sofa. "Especially to you. I think you have the right to know. She held out the photograph to Victor with visibly trembling hands. I never told the whole story. Maybe it's time you found out the truth. Victor took the photograph carefully. It was an old photo, clearly taken a few years ago. The quality wasn't the best, but the people in the image were very clear. In the photograph, Helen was next to an elderly gentleman. She looked younger, her face less marked by exhaustion, smiling genuinely. The man beside her was tall, even sitting down, with well-groomed white hair and kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. Emily, visibly younger, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, was sitting comfortably on his lap, smiling at the camera with childish joy. Victor looked at the photo more closely, carefully studying the elderly man's face. There was something familiar in those features, something that made his heart race without him understanding why. The eyes, the shape of the face, even the way he smiled. Suddenly, the realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Victor's eyes widened, and he brought his free hand to his mouth, clearly shaken. "It's my grandfather," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Helen nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I took care of him for years," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "until the end, until the last day of his life." The silence that followed was heavy and charged with emotion. Victor kept looking at the photograph, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emily, who didn't fully understand what was happening, looked between the two adults with growing curiosity. How is this possible?" Victor finally managed to say, "I was his private nurse. I took care of your grandfather for the last 3 years of his life. Every day from morning till night." Victor lowered his head, and Helen could see tears starting to run down his face. "I should have been there," he said, his voice broken with emotion and guilt. "I should have taken care of him myself. It was my responsibility." Helen stood up from the armchair and approached him, touching his arm gently. "Victor, you couldn't have known. You were busy with your life, with your business." He understood that. "That's no excuse," Victor interrupted, still looking at the photo. "He was my grandfather, the only family I really had, and I abandoned him." "You didn't abandon him," Helen said firmly. "He talked about you constantly. Always. He had a picture of you on his bedside table." Victor looked up at her, surprised. "He kept a picture of me. He cherished it. It was a photo of you as a child, smiling, wearing a baseball uniform. He looked at it every day." Victor felt his chest tighten even more. "And what did he say about me?" "He said you had a good heart, even if the business world sometimes made people forget that. He said you were just like his father, that you sometimes got lost in work, but that deep down you were a good person." "How did he die?" Victor asked quietly, as if afraid of the answer. "Peacefully," Helen answered with kindness. "At home in his bed, I was there beside him. He didn't suffer. He just fell asleep and didn't wake up." Emily moved closer to Victor and took his free hand. "Don't be sad," she said with her natural sweetness. "Grandpa Charles wasn't suffering anymore." Victor looked at Emily with surprise. "You remember him?" "Yes, I do. He was very kind. He always smiled when he saw me." Victor looked at Helen, then at Emily, then back at the photograph. A mixture of emotions crossed his face. Sadness, regret, but also a strange sense of connection. "You two took care of him when I wasn't there." "He was easy to care for," Helen explained. "Even when he was sick, even when he was bedridden, he was always polite, always grateful. He never complained about anything." "And when he died, what happened to you?" Helen looked down. "The family decided they no longer needed my services. They fired me the day after the funeral." Victor felt anger rising in his chest. "Who made that decision?" "It doesn't matter now," Helen said quickly. "What matters is that I took care of him with all the love I had, and he knew it." "Did he leave anything? Any message for me?" Helen hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "He said a few things before he died. He said that if you ever came back looking for him, I should tell you that he never stopped loving you. and that he understood why you were always so busy. Victor could no longer hold back his tears. They streamed freely down his face as he held the photograph against his chest. "I had no idea about any of this," he sobbed. "When I found out he had died, I couldn't even go to the funeral. I was on an international business trip." "He knew you had a good heart," Helen repeated, her own voice choked. "He always said that. He always believed it, even when you didn't come to visit." Emily snuggled closer to Victor, hugging him as she did when she sensed he was sad. "Don't be sad," she said again. "Grandpa Charles liked you a lot." Victor kissed the top of Emily's head and looked at Helen through his tears. "Now I understand so much," he said. "That's why you left the diner without saying anything. That's why you didn't want to accept my help at first. You knew who I was from the beginning." Helen shook her head. "No, I didn't know at first. I only realized later, when you started visiting us regularly. Something about you reminded me of him, but I wasn't sure. It was only when you smiled in a specific way, exactly like your grandfather used to smile, that I knew for sure. And you didn't say anything all this time. How could I? What would I have said? Your grandfather was dead. You were alive, and you two lost each other because of life." Victor held Helen's hand tightly. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for taking care of him when I wasn't there, for giving him love and affection when I failed as a grandson. He was easy to love." Helen smiled through her tears. "Just like you are." Victor looked at the photograph again, seeing his family in a completely new way. It wasn't just Helen and Emily he had stumbled upon in that diner. It was a connection that already existed, a family his grandfather had helped form in the last years of his life. "Now I know why I felt such a strong connection to you two from the very first moment. Maybe your grandfather planned our meeting somehow. Maybe so." Victor closed his eyes for a moment, feeling as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. When he opened them again, he looked at Helen and Emily with a deep, renewed gratitude. "Thank you for bringing me back home. To the family." Helen smiled, and for the first time since they had met, there were no more secrets or hesitations between them. "Welcome back to the family, Victor." Autumn had arrived with its golden leaves scattered across the city streets. The trees on Flower Street were painted in shades of orange and red, creating a colorful carpet on the sidewalks. A few months had passed since the revelation about Victor's grandfather, 3 months of a closeness that grew stronger each day. A routine had naturally established itself. Victor visited Helen and Emily regularly, had dinner with them at least 3 times a week, and gradually became an essential part of their daily lives. On that cold Friday morning, Victor climbed the familiar steps of the red brick building, carrying a brown leather briefcase. His steps were determined, but his heart beat with nervousness and anticipation. He had spent weeks planning this moment. The second-floor hallway was quiet. Victor stopped in front of door 2B and took a deep breath before knocking. Helen opened the door with the warm smile he knew so well, wearing a floral apron over a simple blouse. "Victor!" Emily shouted from the living room, dropping her colored pencils and running to hug him. "Did you bring something special today? You look different." "I did," Victor smiled, hugging the girl. "Something very special this time." Helen noticed the elegant briefcase in his hands and the serious expression on his face. "What is that?" she asked, closing the door. "That's exactly why I came," Victor said, entering the living room. "Emily, can you sit next to your mum? I need to talk to both of you about something important." Emily obeyed, her curiosity piqued by the seriousness in Victor's tone. Helen sat next to her daughter, clearly nervous. "Did something happen?" Helen asked, her hands closing nervously. "Are you okay?" Victor sat in the armchair and placed the briefcase on the coffee table. For a moment, he just looked at the 2 people who had become fundamental in his life. "For these past few weeks, I've been constantly thinking about you two," he began, choosing each word carefully. "About Emily selling candy on the street, about her being out of school for so long, about how such a smart girl should have every opportunity in the world." He paused, then continued. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson, about the first aid class. about how you learned something that saved my life. And I wonder how many other incredible things you could learn if you had the chance." Helen shifted uncomfortably. "Victor, we've already talked about this several times. You don't have to feel responsible for—" "Let me finish, please," he said gently but firmly. "I need you to hear me out." Victor opened the briefcase and took out meticulously organized documents. "Emily," he said, looking directly at the girl, "I wanted to make sure you never have to sell candy on the street again to help your mum." Helen stiffened, preparing to protest, but Victor continued. "I wanted to make sure you can just be a 7-year-old girl, studying, playing, learning new things, without worrying about money." He handed the documents to Helen, who received them with trembling hands. "These are enrollment papers for Riverside Academy," Victor said, watching Helen's expression. "The same school where Emily studied before, where she had Mrs. Patterson." Helen looked at the documents in disbelief, her hands shaking as she read. "This says that the tuition is paid," she murmured. "For how long?" "Until she graduates from high school," Victor replied calmly. "I want her to have everything she deserves. A quality education, school supplies, uniforms, extracurricular activities. Everything." The silence was absolute. Emily looked between her mother and Victor, trying to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Helen held the papers to her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "You," she managed to whisper, "you didn't have to do this." "This is so much more than we could ever accept. I know I didn't have to," Victor replied, his voice growing emotional. "But I needed to repay you. I needed to do something for what you did for me and for the love you gave my grandfather. And I want you to never feel alone." Emily, who finally understood she would be going back to school, jumped off the sofa and ran to Victor, hugging him tightly. "Does this mean I'll see Mrs. Patterson again?" she asked, looking at him with shining eyes. "Will I learn new things every day?" "That's exactly what it means," Victor smiled, returning the hug. "You'll have math, science, and art classes. You'll play with other kids during recess." "And will you still be our friend?" Emily asked, looking him seriously in the eyes. Victor felt his heart tighten. "Always, Emily, forever." "Do you really promise? Promise you won't forget about us? Are you our friend forever?" "Forever. I promise with all my heart." Helen came over and joined the hug, crying with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said between sobs. "Thank you so much for giving my daughter her future back." "Thank you for giving me a family back," Victor replied, moved, "for showing me what really matters." In the following weeks, Victor didn't stop there. Observing how competent and caring Helen was, he began making calls to acquaintances in the city. One September morning, he showed up at the apartment with another envelope. "Helen, I need to talk to you about a job opportunity." Helen, who was making coffee, turned in surprise. "A job? What kind?" "Sit here," Victor said, indicating the table. "I want to tell you about a family I've known for years." Helen sat down, paying close attention. "It's the Morrisons. Dr. James Morrison is a cardiologist, and Dr. Sarah Morrison is a lawyer. They have 2 young children and are looking for an experienced caregiver, someone who can help with the kids and take care of the elderly grandmother who lives with them." Helen leaned forward, interested. "What kind of care?" "She needs help with medications, light physical therapy, medical accompaniment, and especially companionship. Exactly the kind of care you gave my grandfather." "Is it full-time?" "Yes, with an excellent salary and benefits. Since Emily will be studying nearby, you could work during the day and come home every night. The best of both worlds." Helen grew thoughtful. "Why do you keep doing this for us?" Victor smiled. "Because you are my family now, Helen. And families take care of each other." The interview took place the following week and went perfectly. The Morrisons were impressed with Helen's experience and her genuine kindness. She was hired on the spot, with a salary higher than any of her previous jobs. A month later, on a clear October morning, Victor stood beside Helen on the sidewalk in front of Riverside Academy. Emily wore a new uniform, a navy blue skirt, a white blouse, polished shoes, and a backpack. Helen had spent the morning getting Emily ready, making sure every detail was perfect. It was her first day back at school, and Helen wanted everything to be special. "I'm nervous," Emily confessed, looking at the school gate where other children were entering. "What if I don't remember how to be a good student? It's been a long time." Victor knelt down to her level, straightening the tie on her uniform. "You know what I think," he said, looking into her eyes. "Being a student is like riding a bike. Once you learn, you never completely forget. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Helen said, bending down and fixing Emily's hair. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson is waiting for you. She was very happy to hear you were coming back." "Is Mrs. Patterson still there?" "Yes, she is," Victor confirmed. "And she said she has lots of new things to teach you." "And will you be here when I get out?" Emily asked, still insecure. "We'll be here every day," Helen promised. "I'll pick you up, and Victor will have dinner with us whenever he can. Every single day." "Every day," Victor confirmed, extending his pinky finger. "Pinky promise." Emily smiled, her confidence returning, and linked her finger with his. "Pinky promise," she repeated, sealing the deal. Emily hugged her mother, then Victor, and walked bravely toward the gate. She turned once to wave, and they waved back enthusiastically. Helen watched her daughter pass through the gate and disappear among the other children, her heart finally at ease. For the first time in months, she felt she could breathe without worrying about the immediate future. "She's going to be fine," Victor said softly, touching Helen's shoulder. "Because she will," Helen agreed, tears of happiness in her eyes. "For the first time in a long time, I finally believe that everything has started over, that we have a real future ahead of us." Victor stood beside her in silence, both of them looking at the school where Emily was starting a new chapter. The morning sun warmed their faces, and the future seemed full of possibilities. "Victor," Helen said quietly. "Yes? Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Victor smiled, feeling peace in his heart. "I think he always knew we would get here together. Maybe he was the one who orchestrated our meeting. Maybe so. Maybe that day at the diner wasn't an accident." They stood there for a few more minutes, two adults who had found a second chance at having a family. It wasn't the traditional family they had imagined, but it was perfect just the way it was. As they started walking to the car, Helen asked, "What do we do now?" "Now," Victor replied, opening the door for her, "we just live like a family. An unexpected family. The best family I've ever had." Helen got into the car smiling. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about tomorrow. She had a job, Emily was in school, and they had Victor. They had each other. As Victor drove, Helen looked out the window and thought about how quickly life could change. Months ago, she was counting coins for a sandwich, desperate and hopeless. Now, she had a family that began in a busy diner, with a brave little girl and an emergency procedure. A family united by gratitude, courage, and the unexpected love that blossomed among three people who needed each other. There, together in the car, driving through the streets on an autumn morning, they discovered they belonged to each other as an unexpected but perfect family. The bonds that united them would never be broken. Years later, when Emily graduated from medical school, she dedicated her degree to three people. Helen Charles, who always believed in her, Victor, who gave her opportunities, and Grandpa Charles, who had somehow brought them all together. At the ceremony, Helen cried with pride. Victor was by her side, now her husband of 2 years. Emily had been the flower girl at their wedding, radiant with happiness. "We did it," Helen whispered during the ceremony. "We did it," Victor agreed, squeezing her hand. Emily, on the stage, met their eyes in the audience and smiled. The little girl who sold candy on the street was now a doctor. It had all started with courage in a diner. After the ceremony, Emily approached, still in her cap and gown. "Thank you," she said, hugging them both, "for everything." "Thank you for saving us," Victor replied. "Literally and figuratively," Emily laughed. "I think we saved each other." And it was true. In a diner, 3 lives were transformed forever. Helen found stability and love. Victor found family and purpose. Emily found a future. They discovered that the best families are the ones we choose, not the ones we are born into. The bonds that never break are built with love, gratitude, and courage. And those 3 had built something unbreakable. An unexpected but perfect family.